In the summer of 1942, as Allied offensive strength was massed in England, that courageous nation was still suffering from the Battle of Britain. The Luftwaffe no longer got through as often as it had earlier in the war, but it would be many months and even years before London would resemble its pre-war self. Life for the British became even more bleak as the scarcity of food resulted in further cutting of the already meager rations. That year, the British citizen was limited to 24 cents worth of meat as his total allotment for the week.
Our friendly invasion would vastly increase the strain on the population. We had to expect inevitable clashes with civilian processes, and in spite of the best will in the world on both sides, we had to anticipate and do our best to prevent mutual irritations that would naturally lead to misunderstandings and could not fail to impede the war effort. If the United Kingdom had possessed great open spaces in which to concentrate the American forces, the problem would have been less acute. Intensive programs were devised to fit the newly arrived Americans into the highly complex life of a thickly populated area.
For American GIs, the little luxuries of life were available at their own post exchanges. The scarcities which had become commonplace to every Briton did not exist for the American soldier.
I have never yet met an American soldier who did not feel that America had a staunch and sturdy ally. We found, however, that a British family, inspired by a determination to show real hospitality, was likely to utilize an entire week's rations to entertain an American. At once, we encouraged soldiers to carry rations on these home visits.
On the streets of English cities, American troops became a familiar sight. The major problem of accommodating the 2 million Americans who would be arriving in Britain during the next 2 years was the immediate task at hand.
The plan to bring large fighting forces to Great Britain required those highly populated islands to ready themselves for the absorption of 2 million Americans and to provide for them necessary facilities, including training grounds in which to prepare for the great invasion. Because of the density of population, every soldier arriving in England made living conditions just that much more difficult.
Training a man into perfect physical condition is not the only concern of a good Army commander. An equally important consideration is the psychological preparation for a soldier about to go into battle.
I have heard commanders attempt to oversimplify this psychological problem with the assertion that soldiers fight for only a few simple reasons: pride in a unit, respect for the opinions of comrades, and blind devotion to a leader. These are important, and the wise commander will neglect none of them. But the American soldier, in spite of wisecracking, sometimes cynical speech, is an intelligent human being who demands and deserves basic understanding of the reasons why his country took up arms and of the conflicting consequences of victory or defeat.
Yes, take children from the faith of their fathers and teach them the state is the only church. And the head of the state is the voice of God. That was the way of life. Or better, the way of death. In that other world.
Belief in an underlying cause is as important to success in war as any local discipline.
From America, too, came the machines and equipment the troops would need in mounting an invasion force. The modest flow of material which landed in Great Britain in the summer of 1942 was to increase to gigantic proportions during the 2 years that followed. But in the summer of 1942, the amount of that material fell short of Allied needs.
The great bulk of the fighting equipment needed for the invasion did not exist. Production limitations ruled out any possibility of a full-scale invasion in 1942 or early 1943. Indeed, it soon became clear that unless practically all American and British production could be concentrated on the single purpose of supporting the invasion of Europe, that operation could not take place until early 1944.
But the much-needed equipment soon began arriving in larger quantities on the hopelessly overcrowded island.
The United Kingdom was one gigantic air base, workshop, storage depot, and mobilization camp. It was claimed facetiously that only the great number of barrage balloons floating constantly in British skies kept the islands from sinking under the seas.
As the tempo of preparations mounted, the method by which the Allies would finally come to grips with the enemy became the principal concern of General Eisenhower and his associates.
There seemed to be three lines of action deserving of earnest study. The first was the direct reinforcement of the British armies in the Middle East in an effort to destroy Rommel. The second was to seize Northwest Africa to catch Rommel in a giant vice. The third was to undertake a limited operation on the northwest coast of France with a relatively small force, a bridgehead for use in the large-scale invasion agreed upon as the ultimate objective.
Meanwhile, the Allied air offensive against Germany was accelerated, while the Luftwaffe's attacks on England declined. In frequency and intensity, the Allied strikes were the greatest in the history of air warfare at that time. Heavy long-range bombers were becoming available in increasing numbers. As many as 600 were often used in a single Allied raid on Germany.
The U.S. Army Air Forces believed in daylight bombing with the heavily defended fortress type of bomber as the backbone. I emphatically agreed. We believed that in close formations permitting concentration of a terrific firepower, they could carry out daylight operations without undue losses.
There's Charlie doing his twirl again. I wish I had something like that to play with. You guys wouldn't know what to do with a turret if you had one. Took 6 months to teach you how to pull a trigger. Well, it taught us anyway. All right, fellas. Can the small talk and keep the intercom open. Enemy fighters at 7 o'clock high. Joe, you're firing when they're too far out. Let them get in closer. Closer? I could have kissed that last guy, if you was more my type.
At the target areas deep in enemy territory, Allied bombers usually encountered stiff opposition. But our losses at that time were not great, and the results in bombed-out Nazi war factories and other military objectives were considerable.
Bombs away!
followed, the Germans began to shoot down a higher percentage of our bombers, which still operated without long-range fighter support.
The Prime Minister urged us to give up the whole idea of daylight bombing and start training our crews for night work. Their experience had driven them to bomb only at night. Otherwise, they suffered unsupportable losses. We believe that this was due to the fact that British bombers were designed for range and weightlifting at the expense of speed and defensive firepower. The arguments on this point were long, with neither side convinced.
On the Nazis' other front, our Russian allies were giving ground, but stubbornly resisting Germany's powerful eastern offensive. With no enemy ground forces to contend with on the Western Front, Hitler concentrated a large percentage of his crack troops in the titanic struggle with the Russians.
Russia was insistently demanding an offensive move by Great Britain and the United States during 1942. And there was a lively fear that unless such a move was undertaken, the gravest consequences might ensue on the Russian front.
In London, on July 24, 1942, at a top-secret meeting of the combined chiefs of staff, the decision on the location of the first Allied ground offensive against Hitler was made.
It was determined to proceed with the planning for the invasion of Northwest Africa with an Allied force of all arms, to be carried out under an American commander. The operation received the name Torch.
To most Americans, the objective, the teeming, squalid territory of French North Africa, had long been thought of as a colorful land of mystery and intrigue. To the bulk of its population, the war was of very little interest, and business went on as usual. Nazi ships tied up regularly in North African ports such as Algiers, which were controlled by the Vichy French government, to take aboard food and supplies for delivery to German troops in Europe. Theoretically, the Vichy French government was neutral, and thus its French North African territory was free of access to any nation's ships. But actually, Vichy was unofficially under Hitler's domination, and the French North Africans, cooperating with Vichy, furnished the Germans quantities of supplies. The Allies were aware of the alarming possibility that German troops might march unopposed through Vichy France and Spain, then cross over to Spanish Morocco, thus sealing off the Mediterranean completely and complicating any Allied plans for a North African invasion. Spain's dictator, Francisco Paulino Franco, though neutral, had always been well disposed toward his fellow fascist in Berlin. The possibility of Spain joining the Axis was not considered far-fetched in the summer of 1942. Under Franco's control was Spanish Morocco, across the Strait of Gibraltar, a most strategically situated North African territory, which boasted some 140,000 native troops. Key to the whole problem of possible resistance to an Allied invasion of North Africa was the Vichy French government, which ruled the territory where the landings were to be made. Its premier since the fall of France in 1940 had been aging Marshal Henri-Philippe Pétain, hero of the Battle of Verdun in World War I. Assuming Pétain's powers in April 1942 was crafty Pierre Laval, who followed a policy of complete collaboration with the Nazis.
Marshal Pétain was a name that at that moment was more profound in its influence on North African thinking and acting than any other factor. Each French commander had sworn an oath of personal fealty to Pétain. None of these men felt that he could be absolved from that oath or could give any order unless given by Admiral Darlan as their legal commander.
The prized French fleet was under the complete control of Darlan, Though he had constant dealings with the Germans, Admiral Dallar kept his promise to Churchill never to turn the French fleet over to the Nazis.
We had to be prepared to fight against forces which were estimated to number 200,000. But our governments were clear in their instructions that we were to strive to create an ally in North Africa.
To try to unsnarl some of the unfortunate political complications, President Roosevelt sent to Algiers as his personal representative Mr. Robert Murphy, who became ranking State Department officer in North Africa.
Affable, friendly, exceedingly shrewd, he was admirably suited for his task. Unquestionably, his missionary work had much to do with eventual success.
General Eisenhower's headquarters for Operation Torch was established within sight of the African continent at Gibraltar, the only Allied spot of ground in all Western Europe. Allied government leaders were convinced that General Henri Giraud, just escaped from a Nazi prison, could lead the French in North Africa into the Allied camp. But at first, Giraud expected to be overall commander. As the date for the invasion approached, the atmosphere in Gibraltar became suddenly tense.
True, there was tenseness. One could feel it in every little cave makeshifting for an office. Yet, in spite of the certain consequences of any enemy air attack, there was a definite buoyancy. Soldiers, sailors, and airmen congregated there were stimulated by that feeling of exhilaration that ensues when one leaves months of grinding preparation behind and turns expectantly to a bold venture.